The air hummed with the quiet buzz of a mild Los Angeles afternoon. The sun peeked through wispy clouds, warming the pavement of a sleepy Melrose Avenue. Outside a modest café, a man sat alone at a small table, his sunglasses shading his face from the occasional glances of curious passers-by. Though his features had softened with age, his presence was unmistakable. It was Clint Eastwood, a Hollywood icon. Even in his stillness, he exuded an aura of quiet command, as if the world were simply a backdrop to his contemplative solitude. Strangers walked past, hesitating as they recognized him. Some debated asking for an autograph or a quick photo, but his air of introspection kept them at bay. Across the street, unnoticed by all but a few, stood a man whose presence was the polar opposite of Clint's. He blended into the city's background, his tattered clothes layered for survival rather than style. His hair, disheveled and matted, framed a face that carried the weight of sleepless nights and unanswered prayers. A small cardboard sign hung loosely in his hand, its edges frayed from days of use. His name was Kevin, and survival had become his full-time job. For 3 weeks, Kevin had called the back alley of a convenience store his home. His nights were spent curled up behind a dumpster, his body aching from the cold pavement. Hunger gnawed at him, sharp and relentless, a constant reminder of how far he'd fallen. As he scanned the cafe, his eyes landed on Clint. He didn't recognize him immediately, only seeing a man who seemed calm, approachable, and perhaps kind enough to spare $1. Kevin hesitated. He had learned the hard way that asking for help often led to rejection or scorn, but desperation has a way of silencing doubt. Taking a shaky breath, Kevin crossed the street. Each step felt heavier, the distance growing longer in his mind. When he finally reached Clint's table, his voice barely carried over the city's quiet hum. "Sir, could you spare $1?" Clint looked up slowly, pulling his sunglasses down just enough to meet Kevin's eyes. His face betrayed no emotion, his gaze steady and unreadable. For a moment, Kevin wished he hadn't asked. He braced himself for a dismissive wave or a sharp word. But instead, Clint leaned back in his chair, his expression softening just slightly. $1? Clint repeated, his tone calm, almost curious. He paused, letting the question linger. Then with a subtle smirk, he motioned to the chair across from him. "Why don't you sit down?" Kevin froze. "Sit?" he echoed, unsure if he'd heard correctly. Clint nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Yeah, sit. Let's talk." Kevin hesitated, scanning Clint's face for any sign of cruelty or sarcasm. But there was none. His invitation seemed genuine, and against his better judgment, Kevin slid into the chair. "Thank you," he murmured, his voice barely audible. For a moment, they sat in silence. Kevin fidgeted with the edge of his cardboard sign, unsure what to do with his hands. He could feel Clint's eyes on him, not judgmental, but curious. It was a kind of attention Kevin hadn't felt in years, and it made him uneasy. "What's your name?" Clint asked finally, breaking the silence. Kevin blinked, startled by the question. Kevin," he said, his voice shaky. Clint nodded slowly, as if committing the name to memory. "Kevin," he repeated, testing it on his tongue. "So, Kevin, what's your story?" The question caught Kevin off guard. He wasn't used to people caring about his story. Most avoided him altogether, and those who didn't treated him like a nuisance, a problem to be solved with loose change. Kevin began, unsure how to condense years of hardship into a sentence. "I don't usually ask people for money. It's just, I haven't eaten in 2 days, and I don't know what else to do." Clint didn't interrupt. He just listened, his gaze steady and patient. Kevin felt the words tumbling out before he could stop them. "I used to be a contractor," he said, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. "I had a crew, steady work. Then the recession hit, jobs disappeared, bills piled up. Next thing I knew, I was out on the street." He laughed bitterly, the sound hollow and sharp. "Funny, isn't it? I built homes for a living, and now I can't even find a roof to sleep under." Clint's expression didn't change, but his eyes softened. He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "You've been through a lot," he said quietly, "but you're still here." Kevin looked down, ashamed of how broken he felt. "I don't know why," he muttered. "It's not like things are going to get better." "Why not?" Clint asked, his voice calm but firm. Kevin shrugged, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his doubts. People like me, we're forgotten. Nobody cares. Clint's eyes narrowed slightly. People like you? He echoed, his tone challenging. What does that even mean? Kevin didn't respond. Clint leaned back, studying Kevin for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. He slid it across the table, the crisp edge catching the light. What's this? Kevin asked, eyeing the card warily. It's an address, Clint said. A shelter run by a friend of mine. They'll help you get cleaned up, find a job, maybe even a place to stay. But you have to take the first step. Kevin stared at the card, his hands trembling. It felt like a lifeline, but doubt tugged at him. Why are you doing this? He asked, his voice cracking. Clint's expression softened, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face. Because someone did it for me once, he said simply. Kevin didn't know how to respond. The weight of the card in his hand felt heavier than it should, as if it carried the weight of his future. I don't know if I can do it, he admitted. Clint's gaze didn't waver. You've made it this far, Kevin, he said. The next chapter of your story is waiting. You just have to decide to write it. For the first time in years, Kevin felt the faintest flicker of hope. The streets of Los Angeles whispered their usual tunes, a blend of distant honking, hurried footsteps, and the occasional murmur of conversations fading into the city's noise. For Kevin, every sound felt magnified as he walked with a deliberate slowness. Clint's business card still clutched tightly in his hand. The address stared back at him, almost daring him to take the leap. He'd left the cafe with a mix of gratitude and doubt, his mind replaying Clint's words like an old record. Your story isn't over yet. You have to decide what the next chapter looks like. For years, Kevin had believed his story had ended, buried under the weight of broken dreams and empty promises. But now something unfamiliar was stirring within him, a flicker of possibility. As he passed a laundromat, the blinking neon sign caught his eye. The clothes on his back were tattered and stained, remnants of countless nights spent in alleys and doorways. On impulse, he stepped inside, using the last of his crumpled dollars to wash and dry his clothes. As the machines hummed around him, Kevin sat in silence, staring at his reflection in the glass door of the dryer. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to imagine a life beyond mere survival. The shelter Clint had directed him to was a modest brick building tucked away in a quieter part of the city. The fluorescent lights inside were harsh, and the bustle of activity made Kevin feel out of place. People moved with purpose, staff and volunteers tending to the needs of those who'd walked through the doors seeking help. Kevin hesitated at the threshold, the weight of his doubts pulling at him, but then a voice called out, "Can I help you?" It was a woman, her face kind but firm, her eyes searching Kevin's for an answer he wasn't sure he had. Slowly, he held up the business card. Clint Eastwood told me to come here, he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. The woman raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued, but didn't press further. Instead, she stepped aside, motioning him in. Let's get you sorted, she said. The next few days were a whirlwind. The shelter provided Kevin with clean clothes, hot meals, and a place to sleep that didn't involve concrete or cardboard. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. Enough to remind him what it felt like to be human. One morning, a counselor sat down with him, her clipboard resting on her lap. She asked him about his skills, his work history, and what he wanted to do next. At first, Kevin didn't know how to answer. Wanting something felt foreign, like a luxury he couldn't afford. But as they talked, fragments of his old life began to surface. The years he'd spent as a contractor, the satisfaction of seeing a job well done. A week later, the shelter connected him with a temp agency that placed him in a warehouse job. It was grueling work, unloading boxes and stacking pallets. But Kevin didn't mind. The calluses on his hands felt like progress. With his first paycheck, he rented a small room in a shared apartment. It wasn't much, a mattress on the floor, a window that stuck when you tried to open it, but it was his. Through it all, Clint's words stayed with him. You need a chapter, not a sentence. Slowly, Kevin began to believe he could write one. Months passed and Kevin's life started to resemble something closer to stability. The warehouse job turned into a full-time position, and his supervisors took notice of his reliability and work ethic. For the first time in years, he felt pride in what he was doing. One night after a particularly long shift, Kevin sat down at the small desk in his room and pulled out a piece of paper. He wrote Clint a letter, not knowing if it would ever reach him, but needing to say the words anyway. He thanked Clint for stopping to listen, for treating him like a person when so many others had looked right through him. He told him about the shelter, the job, the apartment. It wasn't much, Kevin admitted, but it was a start. A few weeks later, Clint sat in his office, the letter in his hands. He read it slowly, the faintest trace of a smile touching his lips. As he folded the paper and placed it in a drawer, his mind drifted back to his own journey. The strangers who had helped him when he needed it most. The small gestures that had changed his life. For Clint, helping Kevin had never been about recognition. It was about honoring the kindness he'd been shown as a young man. The weight of his success had never erased the memories of leaner times, and he carried those lessons with him like a quiet compass. Meanwhile, Kevin found himself returning to the shelter. Not as a resident, but as a volunteer. He spent his evenings talking to others who were struggling, sharing his story, and offering them the same encouragement Clint had given him. He wasn't just rebuilding his life, he was helping others rebuild theirs. One day, as Kevin stood in the shelter's kitchen, handing out bowls of soup, he overheard a man talking about how hopeless he felt. The words echoed Kevin's own thoughts from months before, and he felt a pang of recognition. "You're still here, aren't you?" Kevin said, stepping forward. The man looked up, startled. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means your story isn't over," Kevin said, his voice steady. "You've got another chapter to write, and maybe it starts right here." The man didn't respond, but Kevin saw something flicker in his eyes, something he recognized. The café on Melrose Avenue remained unchanged, a quiet corner of the city where people came and went without noticing its significance. But for Kevin, it would always be the place where his life took a turn he hadn't expected. And for Clint, it was a reminder of the power of connection, the way a single conversation could ripple outward, touching lives in ways you could never predict. As Kevin continued his journey, he carried the lessons he'd learned with him, not just the ones Clint had shared, but the ones he'd discovered on his own. That hope, however faint, was worth holding on to, and that sometimes the smallest act of kindness could spark a transformation. The story didn't end there, of course. It never does. Because the next chapter is always waiting to be written. And for Kevin, for Clint, and for everyone who's ever needed a second chance, it's a reminder. No matter how far you've fallen, there's always a way back up.